There you
Oh,
go. If you're gonna ask questions, I'm recording. Go for it.
and you know, if I ever came to the Threat Insights weekly meetings, I would know this, but what's the priority for the widget refactoring, the MR widget refactor, and getting a separate tab for that branch's like findings?
I will get you an actual number.
Oh, because I just got a ping about it today. Someone was like, did we know that this thing is halfway done? And Andy was like, yes, talk to Alexander about it. And I was like, It's a good question.
It's a good issue to reference. So right now we are sitting at number 7 on the list for the first step of the refactor to start taking it in that direction. I think there's going to be several things that roll off pretty quickly if you look at that. So stuff that's been in flight for a while, like large projects, like the generic security report, still sitting at the top there. I think the filtering project vulnerability report by vendor name that just barely missed the last release, and then bulk updates and dismissal type reasons. We did the first MVC. Thiago syncing. Where did he go? Yeah, so those first 4, I think, are probably looking good to wrap up, hopefully in this upcoming 13.11 release, which is going to bump everything up a lot higher. And then looking at some of the other pieces, like number 5, the additional security export stuff, hopefully that's not too big of a deal. It's just adding data we already have into the existing CSV report. So it looks kind of far down there, but I don't think it's as far away as people might think. Does that help?
Yeah, I think also I think step 1's complete, and this should say perhaps step 2, but
looks like there is one open MR for 13.11. It's a front end task to do some refactoring on it, and then there's another refactor out there. But that's a good point. Okay. So it does look like we're pretty close to needing to do step 2. So then I should probably add that to the list.
Vendor name. Filter by vendor name. Who wants that? I say you could just stop doing it now, you know? No one wants it.
Anybody that has integrated third-party scanners, I think it's helpful to them to see the difference. And it's helpful to us too, so we can offer compare contrast during demo situations. So a lot of our scanners that we provide, same type technology from third-party vendors, we stack up very well. Usually at parity, some cases a little better, some cases, maybe we have some more, false positives that require a little tuning. But if you're able to actually toggle between the vendors, you can kind of see what is coming from where. And it's just that extra bit of visibility too. There is a vulnerability management solution competitor in the space that does that. It's funny because it seems like, kind of a minor feature, nice to have. Cindy brings this up all the time that they make such a big deal about it. And a lot of customers that use this particular software really enjoy that. It's just a convenience thing that, that actually goes really, really far.
Awesome, thank you.
I mean, if you were still on the Threat Insights team, maybe this would go faster, Alexander, but you abandoned us. You keep asking us where we are.
Yeah, hurry up. I'm waiting for certain projects to be done before I come back, so. Thiago?
Okay, I added 2 questions. The second one is a bit confusing. Maybe we'll skip it. But the first one is, Matt, you keep being asked about a nuke button for the vulnerabilities. Somebody, tries our scanners and analyzes and creates 1 billion findings because it was misconfigured, or they didn't know how to use it, or for other reason they want to start fresh. And you've been very reluctant. So my question is, when are you going to cave in and just do it?
I will cave in when I think the effort of implementing such a feature warrants the amount of demand from customers. I'm still, I don't want to say strongly, but reasonably strongly opposed to just introducing the ability to delete vulnerability records, not without a very robust set of controls and audit functions around that. I've heard from a number of customers that no, don't let anybody delete that. That's bad, because then obviously you could do things like try to sneak in a vulnerability into the master code base, quickly go in, dismiss it, and then delete the record. So if we were to build some sort of large function around that, I'm not sure that there's enough utility out there for customers. On the test mode side, so what I like this idea, but only because I think it sort of solves the problem. Hasn't been validated, but allowing new projects to be put into a test mode, potentially even just an option when you're creating it, and it's a one-way gate. As soon as you turn something off from test mode, it will give you the option that one time, would you like to clear out all the existing vulnerability records? So if you say yes, they'll delete everything. If you say no, it basically is just like any other normal project. You can never put test mode back on. It's like I said, it'd be a one-time thing, probably limited to the owner of that project. I don't think that that's simple, and I think that there are going to be a lot of additional considerations and controls customers are going to want to see around that. So I don't know.
Hence the validation, right? Hence the solution validation.
Right. So I'd say I've heard this maybe half a dozen times over the last year or so, and it always comes down to customers were testing. They weren't really quite sure what they were getting into, so they just kind of, they lit up all the switches and things started happening and there was all this stuff. Maybe it's more on the education side. Don't try to do a test or a proof of concept with a project that you want to keep. You know, fork the project, do a test project, something of that nature. So
I was going to say, because that's an option, right? You can always delete the project or rename it and create a new one, but then you lose issues as well, and so.
Yeah, so like that's kind of why I'm stuck, because I don't think it's a small effort. I think it is still limited in terms of the utility for people. I think that it's also dangerous if we get it wrong. And the way that GitLab's roles are set up today in our permission model, it's not flexible enough for most organizations, especially large organizations. So the idea that you would need to restrict this to only a select few individuals is very difficult. The way that we would typically do that is through the owner role, especially if you're on GitLab.com. But there are definitely organizations out there who do not want the security team to have owner level control like that of projects and groups. And then at the same time, organizations don't want to give security and, you know, sort of audit affecting functions like that to people outside of very specific security users that might be the owners of projects. So it's, I don't know, there's a lot that could go wrong if we didn't do it well. And the easiest thing to do is just do nothing and say, it's a feature. The vulnerabilities are forever in the product. You can always filter out what you don't want to look at. And as you close things out, they'll naturally disappear from, you know, your default view. And we provide a full audit history for the lifetime of the project.
Thank you for that detailed answer. I'm writing down the best I can here in the document.
And I think every time it comes up too, somebody goes, I don't think there's an issue for that. Let me open an issue. And I'm like,
I think Lucas did that.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is that you have to think of it in the context of, if I'm a very large organization, I've probably screwed up one project. I might have 500 or 5,000 projects. So we would be building a feature to address that one time where they did something that they didn't really like to that one project, because I don't think I've ever heard of a customer or a prospect doing this like across the board and going, oh gosh, I screwed up the entire instance. Let's just burn it to the ground and we'll start fresh, right? So again, it just seems like it's painful, but in such a very, very small situation. It seems like maybe just education during the setup process is potentially a better approach, saying, hey, before you turn on the scanners, maybe consider doing this on a test project or make a fork, see what this does.
And Gerard, if anyone ever asks about that in support, there is a script that we ourselves used it. You do need console access. So for self-managed instances, it's probably easier to use, but does come with the usual caveats of back up your data, make sure you know how to restore it, and then you can blast it away. For .com, it's harder because customers can't self-service there. Yeah. But support might every now and then. I think that's what's happening with the last customer who asked it. We'll get support to execute it for them. But yeah, I agree, Matt. If this happens like once or twice a year, yeah, it's a good enough solution for now.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more frequent than that, but I don't think I've heard a use case that was not somebody was trying stuff out with the scanners for the first time and just didn't configure it the way that they ultimately would want it. And then at the end of the tuning process, they have the scanners correct, but then they're kind of looking at it going, well, there's all these findings that maybe I don't care about, or they're not what I was looking for. I don't think I've ever heard of a single customer having that problem with more than one project.
Yeah, the bulk dismiss is always there, right?
Yeah, if you don't like things, you can always bulk dismiss. You can rerun the scanners that way. It may just be, Thiago, I forgot, you also made an excellent point. If you are a self-managed customer, you do have the option to do this yourself. It's really only for .com, and maybe that is the best answer, is that we want maybe a more productized way for support to be able to do this. And so it's, it's simply a support ticket for those customers that care enough about it to clear everything out.
Mm.
Awesome. Alexander mentioned the vendor filter, and it reminded me of a current discussion on the generic security report, because one of the mandatory fields for a vulnerability is a category, which is this a SAST or DAST or container security? But then the report itself has a top level.
Oh, look, Alexander left.
Yeah, yes, like snuck out. Was about to get real. The top level report has a scan.type, which is basically the same field. They just called different things, but what you put in there is, all right, this report will have SaaS vulnerabilities. So right now we have a possibility of, and I've done a little demo with that, where you put in, okay, this is a SaaS report, and then you add a vulnerability for SAST, you add one for container security, you add one for DAST, and these fields are available. And then when it gets imported, what you see in the UI is always the vendor saying SAST, the parent one for the report. But then for the individual vulnerabilities, when you click on them and you go in, you can see the fields that are not available on SAST. So for instance, if you create a SAST report, you have location and one other field that I don't remember what it was. But then for container security, you have an image and a namespace. So if you click in, you see those, and the thing will be reported as SAST. And you say, well, that's gotcha. Not possible. So one of the things that we were talking about is that maybe there should be a generic one that says, you know what, this analyzer, this scanner is generic, and it may generate SaaS things or DAS things. We don't know. It'll come in. What are you thoughts about that sort of area, or maybe it's none, and that's fine. We'll talk about it later.
Talking to Alexander, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Alexander, as interim product manager.
So my thinking on this one is, well, first of all, I realize that as we've sort of evolved vulnerability management, the name for that dropdown is not really, vendor is probably not going to be the best name long term, even shorter term, because we're working on creation of vulnerability objects manually in the UI. So it's more like, well, what was the term Andy and I were talking about for that one? Method. So method of detection, I think, is more appropriate. And that would still allow us to do all the analyzers. The third-party vendors, I think we could still list them as such because we are kind of calling them out separately, or we might be able to rethink that and say, keep vendor as, is it actually GitLab or one of the third parties? And then when you select method, if it's a third-party vendor that uses, let's say, SAST, and you've also run the GitLab SAST, you would actually see a mixing of both results from both vendors, for instance. And this is kind of top of the head, like I haven't deeply thought through it, but I feel like the way that things should be classified is we just need to know the name of where something came from. And I think that that's a lot more open-ended. It doesn't need to be specific. We need to know if it's GitLab or something else. I do see a potential for, and this goes back to James's original brown bag on this month's back on the generic concept, creating your own tools that could just run inside of a pipeline job and output us something. So it may not be a traditional, a SAST finding or a DAST finding or whatever. And we'll need to make sure that we can account for all that in a sensible way. So in that case, the method might just be, custom tool. Or we may actually keep it as the name, right? So it could be, is it GitLab stuff? Is it vendor A, vendor B? Is it custom 1, custom 2, custom 3? Is it manual?
Yeah, that was really powerful. I really enjoyed watching that brown bag from James. He did the time traveler Git demo and some other sneaky attacks on repositories, and the generic. So there was a bit of confusion around the generic schema and the details field. They're related. So the part of what made it confused is that the generic schema was meant to introduce the details field, but then along the way we say, hey, we can introduce the details field to every other schema. So if you're a SAST scanner and you want to add some other details that are that fit some of the components, like a numbered list or a hash or a diff or a free text field, you can go ahead and do that. And then they sort of became one and the same, but they're still different. The idea of a truly generic report goes with what you're saying on the manually entered vulnerabilities. That's the one I thought, and then now your example was good as well. That maybe a customer has a very specific thing that they want to do a custom one for.
Yeah, like let's say that I decide for whatever reason I want to run Nmap against a particular section of my network every time I run a pipeline, just to make sure that there's nothing new that's appeared, right? I don't know, whatever. Using the generic report, that I think would be a great use case for something like that. It's not one of our code analyzers, but it's something that you care about running in the pipeline from a security perspective. And as long as whatever wrapper you've written around Nmap, you could just pull those back in, make the details, the output of Nmap, put that into the structured details field, and then now you've got, what's the new detection type? Custom Nmap wrapper, right? You select that, you see all the things just like you would in any other vulnerability in the report. And then the details, of course, is whatever you've decided to make that transform look like. You're on mute, Thiago.
Am I muted? I said I like that. And something that you mentioned, which was the where something came from, it reminded me of the other part of where something came from that I've been calling source, like a vulnerability finding source, but I don't know if that's what we're going to call it, which is right now when we run an analyzer, it's always associated with the repository and more particularly with the branch. So then we have the concept of, was this found on the default branch or was this found on some other non-default branch? And we treat these things differently. But as our analyzers evolve and as the use cases evolve, we're now thinking that a vulnerability could be associated with other things like an environment. So you could have scanned something in production and found some findings, or in a test or staging environment. That that's something that container security is looking at because of the live container scanning. But I think Dast has the same sort of scenario where you could point Dast at any live website on the internet, and that's not necessarily associated with a branch or with the latest commit in a branch. Maybe it's you know. So yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem.
I'll write this down. But yeah, I don't have a solution either. But I'm looking forward to see what we come up to to work with this.
I think for now, the way that we're talking about it working, and I've only been slightly involved in this, is since you will have to still trigger something like an on-demand DAS scan from a project, because that's where it's configured, any of their findings would actually just turn immediately into vulnerability object records and end up in the vulnerability report, just like they had been on the default branch, because we don't make that distinction today.
Yeah, so I think you and Sam discussed having a tab or having a filter for that as well, going, all right, show me things that are in a branch, or show me things that are in an environment, or give me a separate tab for it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially once we get out into the environment and the networking side of things, we'll have to have a different model for that.
Thank you. I'm just writing it down if anybody has anything.
What Matt, maybe again you might have talked about this somewhere else, but recently we went to Threat Insights became viable, that vulnerability feature. What's the step after that, and what do we need to do to get there?
Complete and execute.
Okay. Hey.
Well, so it depends on what you mean by next step. So in a GitLab kind of public-facing marketing sense, it's to continue to mature the vulnerability management category of Threat Insights to complete. Like that's the next step. So we already did minimal, then we were viable. I think for most stages, I actually don't have any specific data on this, but my hunch is that complete is kind of the wide middle. Minimal is pretty easy to get to. You just have a thing there. Viable is, it's going to definitely take more work because there has to be enough functionality in there for organizations to actually start really using it. Complete, depending on what section, stage, group, feature you're talking about. Like in the case of vulnerability management, we're competing against a very large and established industry. So when people look at our functionality, they're comparing us to products by, in a couple of cases, billion-dollar security companies, because that's one of their bread and butter products. So there's a large amount of that is getting to, I don't want to say parity, because we're not just trying to do one-for-one features, but things that people have come to expect out of a solution that is from a point solution or an established vendor. I think that's kind of the case for vulnerability management. I expect at least 18 months from when we hit viable. So this will probably be, spring-ish, summer of next year before we would really be able to say we're complete from that perspective. To slice it a little bit differently, viable was not going to be achievable unless we had a certain amount of sort of foundational capabilities for the AppSec team, right? I mean, it's typically the security team, they're the ones triaging things, they've got to, they're remediating it. So if it's not workable for a security team, we don't really have a solution in that area. A good component of complete, however, is going to be focused on the developer side of it. So we do talk a lot about shifting left, and that's great. We have all these scanning tools and we have a lot of things that we've provided for development, but where we have some gaps right now is we don't necessarily make it easier to understand what's going on or to really help people sort of engage, right? So it's the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can put scanning in your pipelines, but you can't actually change development behavior without at least some sort of organizational change or support policies, right? So I think that's what a lot of focus is going to be on, kind of in the back half of Complete. The MR redesign is one of the big steps in that direction, is just making the experience better in, you know, in the MR where developers spend most of their time. Some things not quite ready to talk about publicly yet, but having some conversations with some vendors that could provide more information from a training perspective. So that's another big thing that I hear actually a lot from both security professionals and from some of our customers is, cool, the developers are seeing all the stuff that's in the code, but then they look at it and they're like, I don't know what a CSRF token is, or why not having it is bad, or how do I fix it? And so it requires a lot of involvement from the security teams. And that's, I think, a big area for us to address, is how can we sort of help elevate developer security knowledge in the product and really reduce a lot of the friction and the time spent, you know, traditionally going back and forth between security and engineering.
Do you want me to pause the recording so you can mention the...
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Matt.